Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is One God, One Mediator. And it's based on something that Paul said in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 2, verse 5. Let's read that text, and then we'll see if we can't figure out what Paul was talking about. As usual, we're going to be reading out of my translation, which is the Simplified New Testament, and this is the 4th edition. So, as Paul is writing to Timothy, he says, "The truth God wants people to know is that there is only one God, and only one person who can serve as a mediator between God and all people, the man, Jesus, the one sent from God. He willingly offered himself as a ransom payment for all people, and that sacrifice is a powerful testimony to who and what he really is." So, what does Paul mean when he says there's only one God and only one mediator? Well, I think the only one God part is pretty clear, at least so far as is us understanding what he's claiming. But maybe the idea of one mediator needs to be, explained a little bit, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's think about this idea of that there is only one God. There are quite literally hundreds of millions of people in the world today who still believe that there are many gods, not just one God, but many gods. And in some cases, they call them spirits. In other cases, they call them gods. But it can be traced back to very, very ancient beliefs when animism was pretty much the basic assumption that everybody in the world had, excuse me, that there were many gods and spirits, and they had localities, and if you lived in a certain locality, you worshipped the god that ruled that locality or the spirits that ruled that locality. It's a very, very ancient belief. One way to describe it is simply the word we find in the Old Testament, idolatry, when you worship or you offer sacrifices to those gods that do not actually exist, then you are engaging in idolatry. And this is something that God spent a lot of time trying to get the people to understand in the Old Testament, that there weren't lots of different gods. There was just one God. And the name that he used to present himself, when Moses said, "I got to know what your name is. How am I going to go to Egypt and say, God wants you to let my people go?" And they're going to say, "Which God? What's his name?" He said, "I have to have a name to tell him. So what is your name, please?" And the name given to Moses was the name Yahweh. You can read that story in Exodus chapter 3. Now, how do we think in terms of this idea that there's just one God? It's one thing to say there's just one God, but how do you know that there's only one God? Is there some way that you can prove that there's only one God? Can you present some evidence that we can think about and understand that in fact there is just one God? Well, yes, in fact there is. Now, it's not easy, and some of you have not been trained in the use of Western philosophy and Western logic. And what we're going to get into here requires a little bit of a logical analysis, and it's difficult to do if you haven't had the sort of education where you've been trained to do that. But I found that people, if they stop and think, they really can understand, even if they haven't had the training. So let's see if we can't do that. Let's see if we can't figure out how we can know that there's just one God. And I think the simplest way to do it is to think in terms of what is the concept of God. In other words, when we talk about God, that's a very generic word, and there's a word in almost all languages for the word God. Like in English, we say God. In ancient Greek, they would say theos. In Middle Eastern countries, they say Allah. Okay, and there are different words that mean God. Okay, but not thinking about what words are translated, as God. In the Old Testament, the word God came from the Hebrew word Elohim. Okay, and so when you read a passage in the Old Testament where it says, I am the Lord your God, what it really says in the Hebrew is, I am Yahweh your Elohim. Okay, so his name is not the Lord, his name is Yahweh. They just didn't like to say his name, so they translated it as the Lord. Okay, but he says, I am Yahweh, I am your God. Okay, well, what does that mean? What is that concept of God? What does it mean to be a God, or to be the one God? Okay, well, if you understand the word God, what you're really talking about is the absolute ultimate conception that is available to the human mind. The 12th century theologian Anselm made an argument that's called the Ontological Argument, and he described God as that than which a greater cannot be conceived. Now, it's easy to understand the words that he used, that than which a greater cannot be conceived. We understand those words. If you speak English, you know what those words mean. But getting at the actual concept, getting behind the words into the logic of the thing, a concept that is so great that a greater concept cannot be conceived. You see, that's what I mean when I'm talking about the idea of the ultimate, the concept of God. The word God describes the ultimate thing that the human mind can conceive. Okay? Now, when Anselm first put his argument out there, he sent it out to a lot of people for them to look at and think about and talk about. And there was a guy, a monk, named Gonello, and he didn't like the argument. He said, no, this is all wrong. He said, this doesn't work. It's like saying, if I can conceive of the greatest possible island, then that island must exist. And of course, that's not what Anselm was saying at all. And so Anselm replied to him and said, no, Gonello, you've missed the point. It's not the greatest thing of this thing or that thing, the greatest horse or the greatest mountain or the greatest computer or the greatest person or the greatest this or the greatest that. It is, there is a concept that the human mind can go to, and it is the absolute greatest concept that can be conceived. It's not an individual object like a thing, an island, a horse, a whatever, but it's the greatest concept that the mind can conceive, and that is God. And Anselm says, and because we can think about that, then we know that God does in fact exist. Now, it's a hard argument to understand. Took me a couple of years, literally. Took me a couple of years of working on it to try to figure it out, try to understand it, and be able to know that Anselm got it right. And it may take you a while too, but maybe if you think in terms of the word ultimate, it'll be a little bit easier. Okay, we know the English word ultimate. There can't be anything above the ultimate. And there can't be two ultimates. Because if there are two ultimates, or 5, or 10, or 18 million, whatever the number is, then none of them are the ultimate. The very meaning of the word means that there can only be one. There can only be one. And so that's the idea behind God as the absolute ultimate conception available to the human mind. And there can only be one. Because as soon as there's another one, then neither of them is the ultimate. See, it doesn't work with the logic of the language. It just doesn't work. There's only one God. And when you understand what the word or concept of God is, then you realize, well, of course there's only one. There can be only one. There can't be more than one. So there's only one God. There's always only been one God. People have believed that there were many, but they were wrong. And those who today still believe that there are many gods, they're wrong. There aren't many. There's just one. And he identifies himself as Yahweh. Okay, now, what is this idea of the mediator? Well, a mediator is a word that means a go-between. Okay, if you have two parties and they're having an argument and they're not getting along, okay, and this one says this and then this one says this and they're back and forth, okay, and then someone comes along and they get in the middle. They get between the two. That's hard to do when I only have two hands, right? If I had a third hand, I could put it up between the middle, but I can't. So you got two parties, and someone comes along in the middle, and they represent this party to these people, and they represent this party to these people, and they're a mediator that works with both sides to bring them together. Okay, see, that's what a mediator is. Someone who's a go-between. And they function in between the two parties. Well, one party is God, and the other party is human beings. And what Paul is saying is that there's only one God, and there's only one mediator between God and human beings, and that person is Jesus. He's the person that goes between God and us to help us come together to solve the problem of sin so that we can be reconciled with God. And he did that by offering himself as a sacrifice so that God could forgive sin. And now that he's done that, anybody who comes to God with a penitent heart, turning away from sin, confessing their sin and saying, I'm a sinner, please forgive me and help me turn away from sin and live a better life. That person, when they're baptized for the forgiveness of sins, that person's sins are forgiven. And they are then reconciled to God. And so they can enjoy a relationship with God. That's what Paul was talking about in that passage when he said there's only one God and one mediator between God and man. Well, I hope these thoughts are helpful to you, enlightening perhaps, helping you understand a little bit more about the concept of Christianity and the idea of one God and one mediator. So as you think about these things, I would also encourage you then to read the Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.